Hi, this is Drake again, and this video is going to be, at least the beginning is going to be about Rings of Saturn by W.G. Sebald, but I just have one preliminary remark to make. Today, me and my friend recorded a podcast about a Brazilian poet named Carlos Drummond de Andrade, and that's the third podcast that we've done, and the name is called A Tale Told by an Idiot, a literature podcast, and I'll put a link in the description to it if you're interested. The first episode we did Fernando Pessoa. The second episode was Frank O'Hara, and then this one was Drummond. And we're planning on continuing in that fashion of doing an English language and then a Portuguese, switching off like that. But if you're interested, and this video is going to be mainly about the Rings of Saturn by W.G. Sebald that I just recently read. And the thing that got me into this book was the KCRW radio interview that he did with Michael Silverblatt, I believe in 2001, I think a week before he died. And I just love that whole video. I mean, it's just audio really, but I've been introduced to so many good authors from that video. He talks about Gottfried Keller, who I have recently purchased, Greene Henry, which is autobiographical somewhat, and then he talks about Thomas Browne and a bunch of other people. It's worth listening to. And I did really enjoy the book. It starts out as like a travel diary where he's going to England, and he sees some parts of it are just like a relatively normal travel diary where he describes the events, describes the scenery, and I do like that genre. The thing that got me into one of my favorite authors, Goethe, was his Italian Journey. And I still read that book just whenever I want to just enjoy something. So I do like that genre, and also the people he talks about in the book they just happen to be some I really like too. So I think I'm really going to enjoy reading the rest of his books, but I think the first thing I'll get into is just I'll read one quote from the book that I think is representative, and it's the only quote that I highlighted. I read it on my Kindle, and it's the only quote that I highlighted, so must have meant something. But okay, so this is the one quote I highlighted from it. Unfortunately, I am a completely impractical person, caught up in endless trains of thought. All of us are fantasists, ill-equipped for life, the children as much as myself. It seems to me sometimes that we never got used to being on this earth, and life is just one great, ongoing, incomprehensible blunder. And the book is not really filled with digressions like that too often, where the author imparts discourse directly, but I think that's an accurate statement for me. And the second part of the book, I would say it's mixed thoroughly, but I'd say the one half is a travel diary, and then the second half is about authors. One of the main ones being Thomas Browne, who I've read before and have read continuously since I found him, but there were definitely some interesting comments that W.G. Sebald made, who is named Max, I suppose. At least in that interview, uh, Michael Silverblatt says, "I'm sorry, I don't know your name." He says, "My friends generally call me Max." But Thomas Browne has been a fascination again recently after I've read that other book. New York Review of Books Classics publishes this, the Religio Medici and Urn Burial, which is a really enjoyable book. I have a lot of little post-it notes in it that I don't usually do because I think they're generally a waste. But the main thing that I like about Thomas Browne, and I read this in a academic essay just tonight, but it kind of brought it to my mind mostly, is that he's really playful, and the essay mentioned, and I don't know if I'm saying this guy's name right, Huizinga Johann, who was like a guy who wrote a book, Homo Ludens, which is focusing on the idea of play as a integral part to humanity, which I haven't read, but William Gaddis in Agape Agape mentions it quite frequently. So it's probably a good book, but I haven't read it anyway. But Thomas Browne's writing style is very playful. Like one thing that just comes to mind is he said that he really doesn't like, I guess, sexual procreation. And he would prefer that people would procreate like trees, not having to come into vulgar coition. I think he says it like that, but it's kind of like that, where it's like fantastical, goofy things that really no one would think of, but in that way they're humorous that you'd never think of them. There's someone that watches these videos that said they had an interest in English Renaissance literature, and I talked to them, and I realized my ignorance in the area, really. And I've been on the last maybe 4 days, however long it was, 5 days, I've just been learning as much as I could about it. More like surface level learning, really, but I've been reading a lot of Wikipedia pages and some source material that those Wikipedia pages reference, and then a lot of the works online of those authors. And this goes along with the feeling of Rings of Saturn that I gathered. I gathered that he goes to a library, reads, fills his mind with, becomes drenched with words, fills his mind with so many ideas that when he writes, they're usually good ones. But some of the interesting stories that I found out were, the first one that I really thought was fascinating was the poet Philip Sidney, who died in the Netherlands, the Low Countries, when he was 32. He met the Italian Giordano Bruno in, I think, 1583, something like that, when Bruno was coming to London to try to find sponsors and scholarship there. And Bruno subsequently dedicated 2 books to Philip Sidney, which I thought was fascinating. The first, The Shepherd's Calendar by Edmund Spenser, was dedicated to Philip Sidney also. And I'd say Spenser is the one I'm least knowledgeable about of that time period, who is considered great. Which I plan on fixing that shortly, but And then along with that, I found that there was this. I looked into George Chapman because of his fame with Keats, I guess, if you want to put it that way. But he has On Reading Chapman's Homer is a famous poem by Keats. I'm sure everyone knows. But it kind of got me curious. Like I was like, well, shoot, if Keats liked him so much and I don't know anything about him, surely I'm missing something. And I was missing something. He has two early philosophical poems called. Oh, I can never remember the name of it. Give me 1 second. I wrote it down. I always think of the. I don't know. I'll just read it. The Shadow of Night, which I guess in Greek is skia niktos. And it talks about more or less the benefits of night and how it's a good time for contemplation. And he really takes a more beneficial aspect to nighttime, which you wouldn't expect. And that in one way makes it more interesting, but these are two quotes from it that I wrote down. If these be dreams, even so are all things else. And the second quote, which I thought was pretty interesting, no pen can anything eternal write that is not steeped in humor of the night. And as far as that goes, I've always heard people say that Shakespeare's tragedies are his best. And that last quote, I think is probably Chapman saw that also. And George Chapman saw military action in the Low Countries about 10 years after Philip Sidney had been killed there. He was plagued with early debt in his life. He tried to. It was some scheme with bonds, and he put himself in debt, but he never saw the full amount of money that he was promised. So he was plagued with debt his whole life, which is an impending doom I'm planning on experiencing with school, and he died in debt and poverty, which I think is really unfortunate. But there's like an apocryphal story about the School of the Night, which was supposedly centered around Walter Raleigh and the supposed what was it called? Conspirators, I guess you could say. No, that's stupid. But the people, his companions in that School of the Night, were George Chapman, Christopher Marlowe, Walter Raleigh was there, and it was supposedly like a school of atheism, I think. Someone derided Walter Raleigh as being the head of. It seems to me mostly a fiction by scholars. And there's a quote in Love's Labour's Lost by William Shakespeare about something like the School of the Night, which supposedly gives credence to that. There are other things that I wrote down, and one of the interesting things that I didn't know about Thomas Browne before I read Rings of Saturn was he had a library of like rarities, basically, and it's almost certainly completely imaginary, where he just came up with fictional books, letters. I think it's called a museum clausum or a bibliotheca abscondita, something like that. And like one of them that one of my friends liked was a ring found in the belly of a fish when some Venetian guy married the sea. There's a couple from like a letter from Cicero to one of his friends that never existed. There's it's sort of things like very unusual things, which supposedly was common that time, but I found this interesting section in Walter Raleigh's Wikipedia page where he captured a ship called the Madre de Deus, which means the Mother of God. And it mentions all the stuff that they, like all the booty on the ship that they took for their own and stole. And I just thought it was interesting, and it kind of reminded me of that section of the Rings of Saturn where he mentions some interesting things. Spices, drugs, silks, calicos, quilts, carpets, and color, etc. The spices were pepper, cloves, maces, nutmegs, cinnamon, and green ginger. The drugs were benjamin, frankincense, galangal, mirabilis, aloes, zacotrina, camphor. The silks, damasks, tafadas, alto besos, that is, counterfeit, cloth of gold, unwrought China silk, sleeve silk, white twisted silk, curled cypress. Silk is one of the main focuses also of the Rings of Saturn, because Thomas Browne had an interest in it. The metamorphical aspects of the silkworm. And in China, which is where the silkworms originated, W.G. Sebald does like a kind of like a short history of the silkworm and what it was like there, and then he just goes into Chinese history, and I just really love his digressive approach to it. And a couple more interesting things I found when I was looking was this guy named Thomas Harriot, who lived from 1560 to 1621, was first hired by Walter Raleigh to be tutored in math. And about 5 years later, when Walter Raleigh was planning his Roanoke expedition, he learned the Carolina Algonquin language from two Indians that had been brought back to England. And so when he went on the trip, he was able to speak with the Indians in their native language. And he said it changed his ideas on mathematics. But he also wrote in his report of the time, A Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia, which he wrote when he came back. He wrote in there that the Indians were like almost baffled with the engineering of the white people who came over and the ingenuity of, I suppose, our works. And they couldn't believe that any human could do it, so they assumed the people coming over were gods. Which I've heard that story along with the Aztecs, how they let them in their castle basically, thinking they were gods, and then that's how they basically took over and killed everyone. And another interesting thing I thought about Thomas Harriot was in 1607 he saw Halley's Comet, which comes around every, 76 years or something, and a year later the telescope was invented in the Netherlands. It was called the Dutch Trunk, Trunke, which I thought was hilarious. And in 1608 he got one of those, and he examined the moon, and he drew the moon in finer detail than you can with your eye 4 months before Galileo was able. So that's the time that all this happened. Galileo was still alive. People who knew Da Vinci, their children were still around. One of them being Girolamo Cardano, who met with a guy named John Dee. And John Dee, there's a apocryphal story about him that he sold the Voynich manuscript to Rudolph II, who was the emperor, the Holy Roman Empire, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Although that's not believed to be true, but this Girolamo Cardano was like a math genius, basically. He almost invented the study of probability. He was the first one to systematize the use of negative numbers and imaginary numbers. and his father was friends with Leonardo da Vinci. His father also had, they had rumors about him that he was always in the company of a familiar spirit, but people think that came about because he had a habit of speaking to himself. So people thought he was speaking to some ghost that followed him around. And Cardano also has an autobiography that is published by the New York Review of Books Classics, which I'm probably going to buy and read pretty soon. But one other person that is related to John Dee is a guy named Thomas Digges, whose father helped invent the telescope. Not in the Dutch, but just before. And in 1570 he writes Pantometria, talking about his father's telescope, but he was the first, Thomas Digges was the first one to publish in English the idea of the Copernican revolution, where the heliocentric view of the solar system was published. And there is one interesting connection he has with Shakespeare. After his death, his widow married Thomas Russell of Alderminster, who was named the overseer of Shakespeare's will. And there's that funny story about Shakespeare's will where the only thing he gave to his wife was his second best bed. And I've always thought that funny, was completely absurd, but it is funny. And then here, there's just a note. I wrote a note of another guy, Abraham Ortelius, who was, I think, a Flemish navigator, cartographer, who was the creator of the first modern atlas. And he also, in 1596, 2 years before he died, observed the idea of continental drift. Because, of course, if you stare at the coasts of the Americas and Europe and Africa, you see they fit basically together like puzzle pieces. And that's what he noticed. And then a couple hundred years later, they systematized it and realized it was completely correct. And one interesting thing I was reading, this guy in Spanish is considered the Spanish Thomas Browne, Benito Jerónimo Feijoo. This is by the Catedra Classics. And I was reading just the first couple essays, and they talk about, it's kind of like Thomas Browne has an encyclopedia of vulgar errors, where the masses don't know anything, more or less, and he goes systematically saying, oh, this is what people believe, this is why it's wrong. This is what people believe, this is why it's wrong. And this person mentioned a guy named William Harvey, who was a physician a little bit before Thomas Browne, but almost overlapping completely the same time, who was the physician to James I, who was the guy that funded some of Shakespeare's plays, maybe not his plays, but at least the theater troupe that he was a part of. And he was known for being, like it said of his personality, he was humorous but extremely precise man. He also had a love of the night. It said it was the quiet time for contemplation, and that he enjoyed the most. He enjoyed nighttime. And there's also in the preface to each of those two works by George Chapman, the Soul of the Night, and there's one called Ovid's Something of Sense. God, I can't remember those titles for the life of me, but he talks about in the beginning of them basically how only a few people will understand and appreciate those two poems, that the masses won't understand because they don't know what they're doing anyway. And I just think that's so funny that so many of those people thought this at the time. And it's also the case in Blaise Pascal, who is considered, I guess, maybe a French Thomas Browne for his prose style, because Thomas Browne is considered one of the best prose stylists in English, and Pascal, I think, is similarly considered one of the best. But back to William Harvey, there's a quote of his, and the reason Feijoo mentioned him was that he came up with a very precise description of the circulation of the blood. But every educated physician at the time thought he was wrong, and he was laughed at, and eventually he was seen to be correct, and he was more correct than everyone else at the time. And that's the sort of idea where the masses don't know what they're talking about. Giordano Bruno was killed because he believed in pantheism and believed the sun went around the moon, or the sun went around the moon, the earth went around the sun. But Galileo was part of the Inquisition and had to recant everything and was put under house arrest his whole life. And this is what William Harvey had to say about someone trying to get him to leave his solitude and contribute more because he was so intelligent. Would you be the man who should recommend me to quit the peaceful haven where I now pass my life and launch again upon the faithless sea? You know full well what a storm my former lucubrations raised. Much better is it oftentimes to grow wise at home and in private, than by publishing what you have amassed with infinite labor to stir up tempests that may rob you of peace and quiet for the rest of your days. And he definitely knew that. He knew that from experience, because he lost his reputation whenever he published that work, even though that was the most sophisticated explanation of the circulation of the blood at the time. And it said his personal pastimes were reading literature and bird watching. And I thought that was pretty funny. My dad really likes bonsais, and he's been getting more into it recently. He was into it maybe 10 years ago, but he's just recently got into the Fort Worth Bonsai Society, and he has maybe 15 trees out in the back patio. And he watches these people on YouTube who know everything about bonsai trees. And I think it's really fascinating to watch and listen to someone talk about something they love so much and they know everything about it. And there's an interesting story about William Harvey's death where he experienced a cerebral hemorrhage and he lost the ability to speak. Like, he just could not speak. But what he did was his I think his nephews were there, and he motioned to them to get a scalpel because he thought the problem was in his tongue at first. So he stuck out his tongue, cut his tongue, and saw that didn't help. He thought maybe it was swollen and he would let the blood out and then he would be able to speak, but that wasn't it. Because I assume he lost maybe some feeling in his tongue. And it eventually ended up being that he just had a cerebral hemorrhage and the blood was overtaking his whole brain. He gradually died, I think, over the next several days. But I just think that's a sad way for him to go. But he lived, I think, maybe 20 years before Thomas Browne and died about 20 years earlier. 1578 to 1657. It's just completely fascinating all these guys lived at the same time. And there's one guy I got in here that's Thomas Wyatt. He is he's considered the first guy to bring the sonnet to English. He was born in 1503 and died in 1542. He published translations of Petrarch, and as like a general gossip, garbage, whatever, he supposedly had an affair with Anne Boleyn. I don't know anything about Anne Boleyn, but it's like a famous name that all these romance people write about. But this is one poem of his that I liked. It's called I Find No Peace. I find no peace, and all my war is done. I fear and hope, I burn and freeze like ice. I fly above the wind, yet can I not arise, and naught I have, and all the world I season. That loseth nor locketh, holdeth me in prison, and holdeth me not, yet can I scape no wise. Nor letteth me live, nor die at my device, and yet of death it giveth me occasion. Without eyen I see, and without tongue I plain. I desire to perish, and yet I ask health. I love another, and thus I hate myself. I feed me in sorrow, and laugh in all my pain. Likewise displeaseth me both life and death, and my delight is causer of this strife. And in some of those academic essays I read about Thomas Browne, they really highlighted paradox and, what's it called, oxymoron, antithesis in his poems, like dialectical sort of thing. That's one thing I've always liked about that metaphysical era, like poets, the metaphysical poets. They always have such a precise contrast between things. Like in this poem here by Thomas Wyatt. And for some reason people said Thomas Wyatt was like a simple poet and they think he was bad, but what does that even mean? But one other interesting person I found at the time who also died young was Robert Greene, and he's also not related blood to Thomas Nash, but they knew each other at the time, and they participated in literary squabbles against these, I think, Harvey brothers, I think their names were. But anyway, they would write pamphlets. Yeah, the Harvey brothers. They wrote pamphlets against, deriding the Harvey brothers, and the Harvey brothers did it back. But I was looking up Roger Bacon, who was some mystical guy in the 1200s who supposedly came up with ideas of cars and flying machines and stuff, but only like marginal notes that they weren't really considered functional designs, so he didn't get credit for them really. But he was just one of those priests that thought a lot. But Robert Greene wrote a humorous play, which is his most famous play, and for that play he was considered the first professional writer in England. And it's called Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, and it was published in 1589. And one interesting thing, I haven't read it, I do plan on reading it soon, but one interesting idea I found in it was there's a brazen head that supposedly is all-knowing, and it has the power to build a brass wall around England to prevent anyone from invading. And the main characters are ignorant, basically, and impotent, where as soon as they get it working, they don't use it correctly. All it says is time is, time was, time is past, and then it shatters on the ground. It falls and breaks. And I think that's really interesting that was written in 1589. Then the main thing I guess Robert Greene's known for now is he wrote a pamphlet that was supposedly against Shakespeare when Shakespeare was just getting started. It was published in 1592, which is the year he died, and it was supposedly only a month or so before he died that he wrote this. But it was called Greene's Groat's Worth of Wit Bought with a Million of Repentance. And it makes mentions to Shakespeare's early plays, like sort of in a pun manner, and says he's not very good and all this stuff. And Thomas Nash is a really funny character. And he would write pamphlets against people and then like apologize afterwards. And he was you can tell he's just a really funny character. He was born in 1567 and died in 1601. But he also wrote a book called The Anatomy of Absurdity. The Anatomy of Absurdity. And I wonder if there's an academic study of all those anatomy books, like The Anatomy of Melancholy, The Anatomy of Absurdity. I know they were common at that time, but I wonder where it came from. I don't know. If anyone knows, please let me know, because it's interesting. But Thomas Nash, there's a funny story that he wrote a play with Ben Jonson, and it was considered salacious, and it was stopped from being published. And after they realized that they wrote it, the censors, they imprisoned Ben Jonson, but Thomas Nash caught word of it and left, fleeing for the countryside so he wouldn't get arrested. Can you imagine that? So I just think it's so funny that it was so commonplace back then that you would write a salacious play and then like, oh shoot, I may have to pack my bags and just leave for the countryside for a couple months. But he was a really funny guy, you can tell. And he wrote this little a poem when there was a plague going through, and he was supposedly really nervous about the plague. But he wrote, "Adieu, farewell, earth's bliss, this world uncertain is. Fond are life's lustful joys, death proves them all but toys. None from his darts can fly. I am sick, I must die. Lord have mercy on us." I just think that's so ridiculous, but and then I'll just finish on one funny thing about Robert Burton, who was 1577 to 1640. He was a librarian most of his life, and he published The Anatomy of Melancholy, and he was considered a melancholic guy who never laughed. But there's one writing by Bishop Wyatt Kennett. His first name is White, which I thought was interesting. But this quote is by Bishop Kennett. "I have heard that nothing could make him laugh, but going down to the bridge foot in Oxford and hearing bargemen scold and storm and swear at one another, at which he would set his hands to his sides and laugh most profusely." I think we can all imagine what sort of stuff he laughed at. But and then back to the Rings of Saturn. One part of that book that he kind of mixes the travel with literature is he meets the translator Michael Hamburger, who was originally born in Germany but then left, I believe, during World War II, fleeing from Germany to England. And Michael Hamburger, I've mentioned him before on this channel. He published translations of Paul Celan, who I think he's the best Celan translator. And he also translated the Hölderlin poems published by Penguin Classics. And he doesn't talk much about Michael Hamburger in the book, but he does use it to kind of meditate on his childhood in Germany, W.G. Sebald's childhood in Germany, but maybe through the lens of Michael Hamburger. And he also uses part of the book to talk about Hölderlin, how his kind of like his unsuitability for the world, which is kind of referenced in that quote that I mentioned from the Rings of Saturn. And Hölderlin is one of the most interesting literary characters that I've found, because the story is that he was, basically an extremely intelligent youth. He went to school with Hegel, and he could hold his own with Hegel, which I think speaks for itself. And he was I believe a tutor for someone's wife, and he kind of like fell in love with the wife. Then he traveled to go live with his family, and in the meantime, that woman died. And that almost made him lose his mind there. And I think in the subsequent 3 years after that, he lost his mind, and he basically gave up on the world. And he wrote, he would go by Scardinelli. He would sign, people would come to his house and steal things as souvenirs, saying, "Oh, I met the great Hölderlin and went to his house and I stole this, stole his pen or something." And he would write little poems for them and sign it Scardinelli. And I just think it's so completely fascinating that someone that brilliant and completely intellectually powerful could just kind of sign off, I've had enough. And he lived in the I think it was called a tower room of one of his friends' keep, not a keep, but a castle. And I just think it's so amazing that someone that intelligent could just more or less give up. What hope do any of us have? But I guess that's really the end of my extended digression about Rings of Saturn. I would recommend everyone to read the book. And one guy that I've read recently that is related literary-wise to W.G. Sebald is Enrique Villamatas. I've read his Bartleby & Co., which is about authors who decided to stop writing or decided to not write at all, or not publish at least, which is very fascinating in itself. And his book, A Brief History of Portable Literature, which is about kind of like not necessarily a fake history, but it's like an imagined history of a like literary cult in the west, the left bank or west bank in Paris in like the 1920s, late 1920s, and Samuel Beckett is in there, and Tristan Tzara, Andre Belly, all those guys. They're all characters in it. And Villamatas mentions W.G. Sebald as a literary predecessor, I guess you could say, or literary inspiration. But I really love this, like people writing books, commenting about literature. That's one of my favorite types. But anyway, if you're interested in seeing the podcast, I'm going to put a link in the description for it. Pessoa, Frank O'Hara, and Drummond. And, we're going to be making one in maybe the next couple months. But if you guys have any interesting stories about the 16th century or 17th century, I'd love to hear them, because I'm really diving into like the Spanish Golden Age and like the Dutch Golden Age of that time, and the English Renaissance, I guess they call it, but I think it should call it the English Golden Age. But anyway, if you have any stories, put them in the comments if you have anything to say. And this is a quote by Paul Celan, translated into English from his poem Todesfuge, Death Fugue. It's death is a gang boss. Goodbye.